Hi everyone, welcome back to Beholding Jesus in all of Scripture. This week we are in 1 Kings. Where is Jesus in 1 Kings? This particular book is like grab your popcorn and watch the crazies kind of book. It definitely is a book that shows how people go after their own way. Even after God had been faithful, these people definitely show what happens when people go after their own way. But Jesus can be found in this book. So let's look for him. The first place where we can find Jesus is in the story of Solomon. Now, I'm gonna get you there, but let's just kind of track along for a second here, because I have a point. First of all, we open up this book with David dying, but he gives Solomon a charge, and this charge is that Solomon be faithful to the law. He obey the law, which we find that Solomon did for a period of time. He was faithful to this covenant. He rebuilt the temple. You see his wisdom in action. Now, keep in mind that God deals with people all throughout the narrative of Scripture. God always deals with people according to covenant. All right, that's why I told you when we talked about Abraham, even when Abraham was sinful and he did things that we would consider sinful, God didn't deal with Abraham according to his behavior. He dealt with Abraham according to his covenant. Well, same with the Israelites. However, the covenant that they are under is a covenant of behavior. It's a covenant of blessing and curses according to the standard of the law, which is very behavior-based. Now, when Solomon builds a temple, which we'll read about in Chronicles, God tells Abraham that, or he reminds them of this covenant and basically says that if my people, they're called by my name, that's covenantal, if they will humble themselves and pray, that means if they will be and live according to the standard of the law, God will honor that. He will bless them. He will heal their land. He will always be faithful. In other words, he's saying, I will always be faithful to my covenant. But you have to be faithful to your end of the covenant, your agreement to this covenant, because if not, then you're under a curse, the curse of the law. And the law demanded death if they disobeyed, and God reminds Solomon of this. Now, let's just talk about that just for a second, because I feel like I need to explain something. The command to love the Lord their God with all their heart, soul, and mind, that is based on covenant agreement. It was part of the covenant. It was the hesed, the loving kindness in action of a covenant. Now, they were under a vassal covenant, which was the lesser of all the covenants, which if you've been watching, you'll understand what I'm talking about. This vassal covenant had a command that the lesser party had to be faithful. Now, what's the opposite of love? It's hate, right? So if the people worshiped another god, that was akin to adultery, because it was idolatry and it was being unfaithful to the covenant agreement. God was never unfaithful. He never made a covenant with any other tribes. He was only ever faithful to this covenant with the Israelites, and he never broke his end of the agreement. He was always faithful to them and always defended and always protected them as long as they remained faithful to their covenant agreement. So we find that the people go after other gods. They are unfaithful, and that is akin to adultery, which we read about this, in an allegory story in the book of Hosea, the prophetic book of Hosea, how unfaithful the Israelites had been. All right. So the people are charged to worship only one God, the God of Israel. And the people had already asked for a king because they wanted to be like the other nations. God acquiesces to them, and he's still faithful to them even though they are unfaithful on their end. And so time after time after time after time after again, God, he keeps giving them chance after chance after chance. But we see, and Moses prophesied that this was going to happen. So we knew this was going to happen. The people were going to be unfaithful. And that's kind of the downfall of what we see. Now, one other thing that I wanted to help you understand. In the book of Proverbs, Proverbs chapter 7, there is a proverb that tells a story of a young man who was traveling along, and there was a woman, a prostitute, who is dressed beautifully. She's a beautiful woman who calls to him from the streets and says, come into my house and let's make love all night long, and da-da-da. Well, he goes after this woman. He sleeps with her. But the end of the story ends in death for this young man. Now, yes, we can read the story in a moralistic way and say, yeah, avoid prostitution, avoid that path, remain pure. Yes, there is absolutely 100% truth to that. But this was put in here to give us an allegorical story of what happens when we go after the law, when we live under the law. The law has promises. It looks beautiful. It's like Solomon's temple, beautiful finery and dressed beautifully, but in the end leads to death. It's a covenant of death. Isaiah chapter 28 tells us what God thought about this law. In verse 15, 17, 18, and 21, you can go read it yourself, but I'll just read little bits here. God himself says this about the law. He tells the Israelites, you have entered into a covenant with death. With the realm of the dead, you have made an agreement. And then again, he says your covenant with death will be annulled. That's a promise of Jesus. So God himself said that he never wanted sacrifices. He never wanted the people of Israel to be under a covenant so constraining. And yet we see from the time in Egypt when they left that their hearts kept craving after other gods. They kept going after other gods instead of seeing the beauty of God and his faithfulness. Right? That's why scripture says that all men have gone their way. All men have sinned because their hearts it's like what happened in the garden. Their hearts just kept being drawn into death, drawn back into what the law promised was beautiful, like what the tree in the garden promised beauty. It promised something, but then it delivered death. So, Solomon is a picture, he was a picture of peace, right? His kingdom was, for a time, a reign of peace. He was the king of peace. And for a season, we saw peace. We saw peace restored to Israel. We saw prosperity in Israel. Solomon was dressed in splendor. And so, even the people, you see that the people worked really hard so that Solomon could reign in this splendor. But then you start hearing the language of the people. They complained that Solomon's reign was beginning to be burdensome. It was burdensome. Well, the reason why is because all that splendor required somebody to work hard, and that was the Israelites. The Israelites not only were burdened under the law, but they were burdened under Solomon's reign. And then you start reading the downfall of Solomon, how he went after the women who offered idolatry. His heart started going after the things that led to death. And then eventually you see Solomon's demise, and then his son Rehoboam becomes king after his death. And Rehoboam promises the Israelites that if his father's reign was burdensome, his would be even more so. There was something that he said, that my little finger would be thicker than my father's thigh. That, in other words, he was saying, if you thought that my father was burdensome, I will be 100 times more burdensome. He promised burden to the people, which is really a really sad demise. But here's the point. Where Solomon was a picture of peace, it was a picture of what God wanted for the world, the Israelites. He wanted peace. He wanted prosperity for them. Ultimately, Solomon failed because there was only one alone who would be able to offer everlasting peace and true peace, and that is Jesus Christ. Jesus is not only a promise of peace, but he is peace. He is peace with God and peace with man. One other thing, and this is kind of going to be a tie-in with the next story I want to talk about, which is the story of Elijah. In Deuteronomy 21 tells us about a law, and in this law, it tells us that if anyone hangs on a tree, they are cursed. Now, why would somebody hang on a tree? Well, they were hung on a tree because they would have disobeyed a law that required death. Like there were certain laws that the punishment was death, or usually death by stoning. Now, if this person was killed in such a way, the law said that they were required to hang on a tree until nightfall. Their bodies were taken down so that they didn't defile the ground. And basically, their bodies hanging on a tree was a picture of absolute, complete rejection. They were cut off from the covenant. They were completely out of covenant and out of covenant with God. And it was to show that they were cursed, and their children and their children's children were cursed because of such disobedience to the law. Now, let's follow the narrative backwards a little bit, going back to Genesis. Now, remember where trees first showed up in the garden: the tree of life, tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, this knowledge of tree of good and evil was the tree that trapped mankind, all the way from Adam, in a world of sin and curse. Remember, their curse entered in the garden, the curse of death, because death is the payment for sin, right? And they got trapped in this world, but they weren't supposed to eat of this tree. They were supposed to eat from the tree of life, which they didn't do. But God promised that there would be one who would restore all things. Well, later on in Galatians, Paul writes about this very same law. He said, "Cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree." But then he says that Jesus became a curse for us. Jesus, he took the punishment. He became curse for us on the tree. The requirement of the law, the requirement of obedience, or else there is death. All of the requirements of the law was nailed to the tree with Jesus. In other words, it's like Jesus was nailing himself to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And he reversed the curse because Jesus is the tree of life. So where mankind deserved punishment for disobedience, because you see, that's why scripture says that all men go astray, all men sin. It's because there's not a single one, not even David, not even Abraham, who, because of Adam, because of sin, all men fail. But Jesus, the perfect, sinless, holy one, he took the curse of the law, the curse of death, and it was nailed on his body in our place. And so where Solomon failed as the king of peace, and we see that his kingdom ended up being divided and destroyed and it ended in rubble. So there was no everlasting peace. It was only a short period of time. Where Solomon was just a shadow, Jesus is the fulfillment, and he was our everlasting peace. Now, let's talk about Elijah. Really quick, I was just looking at my notes. I wrote, where Solomon put a heavy yoke on the people. I'm not sure if I mentioned it, but we see that with all of Solomon's splendor, somebody had to pay for it. It put a yoke, a heavy yoke, a burdensome yoke on the people. And we see that they started crying out because the yoke was getting heavy. And then his son Rehoboam was like, I'm going to make, I mentioned that, I'm going to make your burden even heavier. That's why Jesus said that his yoke is light. Where Solomon's yoke was heavy, Jesus's yoke is light. In other words, I'm the one who will carry the burden, and I'm not going to put heavy burdens on you. I'm going to remove the burden, and I'm going to remove the burden of doing and working, and I'm going to put my love on you, which is light indeed. All right, now let's talk about Elijah. Hopefully I could make this quick. Okay, in 1 Kings chapter 17, we see that Elijah is, he's a shadow of Jesus, but he's actually a shadow of a prophet under the law. Now, Elijah demands full punishment because we see these two notorious people, Elijah and Ahab and Jezebel. They are crazy. Those are some crazy people. Okay, so they are wreaking havoc on Israel, brought in worship of Baal, who is also called Beelzebub, who is the Lord of the Flies or the Lord of Dung. He is the god of poo-poo. And so they are worshiping him, and that's who Jezebel invites into Israel. Okay, now he demands full account and justice according to the law. For 3.5 years, there was no rain. And so at this point, he calls Ahab and Jezebel to account. And he says, we are going to have a standoff of the gods. If your God is the true God, then let's see, so he rebuilds an altar, he repairs the altar. There's a sacrifice, and first up is Beelzebub, 850 of his priests. They dance and, dance little dances and jigs and cuts and all sorts of stuff. And meanwhile, Elijah is sitting there mocking their God. Maybe your God's going to the bathroom. It's a play off of who that God was. So we find out, obviously their God is not the true God. But then you see a picture of Elijah, and he gets his sacrifice ready, and he adds water, which water was very precious. Remember, there had been no rain. He puts water on it, and then you see God come down and consume everything, and proving that he is the one true God. Now, I want to just pause here for a second and show you Jesus in this story, because first of all, just the fact that it was consumed after being drenched is pretty amazing. But if we see the greater picture, we'll see the water represents Jesus. Jesus is the cleansing water. Elijah possibly could have been consumed by that fire had he not been drenched by the water. The water basically protected him. Later on, right before Jesus' death, he washes his disciples' feet with water. And then he ties in that, like, the fact that the washing of the water, like that when we're washed by the water of the word, which is Jesus is the word. When we're constantly being cleansed because of Jesus. In other words, he is our protection from judgment. Now, who's doing the judging here? So what was being judged at this altar What was being judged was the lie, the false god. Beelzebub was being judged. Like, it wasn't Elijah that was being judged. He was not being punished. It was the root. It was Beelzebub. So when Jesus died on the cross, Jesus became punishment. He judged sin. He judged sin in his body. Sin was judged. It was judged annulled. It lost its power. Forgiven. That's what forgiveness means. It means to put away. Sin was put away. It was forgiven. Now, that's important when we tie it into the story, because we're going to see the cross, the power of the cross. Jesus is the sacrifice. He is also the cleansing. There's a scripture verse that talks about Jesus being our intercessor. That also is a picture of that water. He became sin for us. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So it wasn't that Elijah was deserving. He was protected, and so were we. We have been protected from the judgment, because judgment was put on Jesus was the judgment, and he judged sin powerless. He is the ultimate sacrifice. He is judgment. He is the water. He was in all of that. Now, let's just go along just a little bit further in this narrative. We see that after the priests are killed, the priests of Baal are killed, the rain comes. Jezebel gets angry. She comes after Elijah. She threatens him. He runs off and goes into hiding and ends up in the very same mountain that the law was given. And he hides himself in a cave, a stony cave. Now, you seen the tie-in? That stony cave, the same place that the law was given. The stones, the law written in stone. Elijah hides in there. And then you see that the angel of the Lord, which is Jesus, shows up and basically asks Elijah, what are you doing here? In other words, why are you hiding in the law, under the law again? You've seen me in action. You've seen what I can do. You've seen my provision. You've seen my protection. You've seen my judgment. And you're hiding under the law. And Elijah throws a fit. Basically, like, why are you letting these people live? Why did you not do what I wanted you to do and destroy these people? Now, God was fully capable of destroying these people, but he wanted to show Elijah something. And he shows up not in the loudness, not in the storm, not in the thunder. He shows up in stillness in the most unexpected way. He showed up in a way that Elijah couldn't wrap his head around, because Elijah was under the law and wanted the law to exact the punishment. And yet God shows up in the stillness, in the quiet, in the most unexpected way. And so we see that same story play out later on in the Gospels, where God shows up in the most unexpected way. He shows up in a manger as a child. He shows up not as an earthly king to destroy the Roman Empire, but to establish a kingdom. He fulfills the law, where at that point the Jewish people lived by the law. They didn't expect the law to have been a shadow and Jesus be the fulfillment. But Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. He is the one who became curse for us. He took on the punishment of sin. He forgave sin. He put it away. And then he gives us the most remarkable gift. And that gift is the gift of righteousness. He brings us into himself, and he loves us as his very own. God shows up in the unexpected places, and it's not in judgment toward the sinner right? Just like the water protected Elijah. It's not in judgment toward a sinner, but he shows up in grace. And so you see, the story wraps up and finishes with Elijah passing his mantle, which is a picture, again, of a veil that covered. Remember the veil that Moses wore over his face because grace and law are not compatible. And that mantle gets passed to Elisha, and Elisha actually represents grace. And we'll read about that, talk about that next week. I hope you saw Jesus in this story, and you have a great week, and we'll come back next week to talk about 2 Kings.